Imagine a hidden chapter of history, a story once thought to be brief and simple. For many years, the tale of the Vikings in North America stopped abruptly at the coastline. We pictured their iconic longships appearing at the very edge of a vast unknown continent. We found their traces in a single, remarkable place. This place is Meadows, a windswept site on the far northeastern tip of Newfoundland. For decades, the scholarly consensus was clear and concise. Vikings reached a land they called Vinland. They established a few short-lived camps. Then, they departed, leaving little behind. Their journey inland was considered non-existent. Their trade networks with native peoples minimal. That was the accepted view, a small footnote in a much larger saga of exploration. Picture a collection of small, unassuming artifacts, unearthed hundreds of miles from any known Norse landing site. These objects, a metal pin here, a fragment of worked wood there, tell a profoundly different story. They suggest something far more complex than just fleeting visits. They hint at sustained trade, extensive travel, and long-term contact. This is a new, bold idea, and it poses a fundamental question. Did the Vikings do more than just arrive? Did they discover and utilize the pre-existing trade routes that crisscross North America? The old story, the one we have told for over 50 years, is grounded in solid, undeniable proof. The Norse sagas, epic poems written down centuries after the events, spoke of a bountiful land to the west. They told of Leif Erikson's voyage to a place of wild grapes, plentiful salmon, and rich pastures. For a long time, these were just stories. Then, archaeologists went in search of physical evidence. In the 1960s, the husband and wife team of Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Meadows. The style of the turf buildings was unmistakably Norse. So were the artifacts found within: iron boat nails, a stone lamp, and a soapstone spindle whorl, an item used by Norse women for spinning yarn. This discovery was monumental. It proved once and for all that Norse people had reached the Americas nearly 500 years before Columbus. Radiocarbon dating and the style of the artifacts placed the settlement squarely in the Viking Age, around the year 1000 CE. Yet, the site also seemed to reinforce the idea of a brief stay. It appeared to be a small, temporary outpost, perhaps a base for exploration or ship repair. The consensus that formed around this discovery was that the Norse had tried to establish a foothold, but ultimately failed, retreating back to Greenland. For a long time, Meadows was both the beginning and the end of the story, the primary evidence and the perceived limit of the entire endeavor. The traditional narrative of the Norse in North America is a tale of incredible seafaring skill culminating in a brief, almost fleeting encounter. It begins in Greenland, where Eric the Red had established a colony in the late 10th century. From this remote outpost, his son, Leif Erikson, set sail westward, guided by tales of a new land spotted by another mariner. The sagas describe his landing in a series of places he named: Helluland, land of flat stones; Markland, land of forests; Vinland, land of wine or land of pastures. For decades, scholars debated where these places might be, with theories ranging from New England to the Canadian Maritimes. The discovery at Meadows provided the first concrete anchor for these tales, confirming a Norse presence on the island of Newfoundland. The site itself tells a specific story. It was not a large permanent town, but rather a collection of workshops and dwellings. Archaeologists identified 3 large halls, a forge for working iron, several smaller huts. The presence of the forge was particularly telling. The ability to repair iron rivets was essential for maintaining their wooden ships, which were held together by thousands of them. The spindle whorl and a bone-knitting needle suggested that women were present, indicating that this was more than a simple, all-male raiding party. It was a base for a community, however temporary, but the evidence also suggested it was not occupied for long, perhaps only a few years, or used seasonally over a decade or two. This interpretation led to a powerful and enduring model of Viking contact. In this view, the Norse were explorers, not settlers in the long-term sense. They arrived, scouted the territory, and perhaps gathered valuable resources like timber, which was scarce in Greenland. They encountered the indigenous peoples, whom the sagas call Skraelings. These encounters were sometimes tense and violent, contributing to the decision to abandon the settlement. The story became one of a failed colonization attempt. The vast North American continent remained, in this telling, largely untouched and unexplored by the Norse beyond this single, isolated coastal base camp. The idea of them venturing deep into the interior seemed implausible. So, for over 50 years, the image was set. The Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the New World, a remarkable achievement. But their impact was seen as minimal, their presence a short-lived experiment confined to the very edge of the continent. School textbooks, museum exhibits, and documentaries all presented this narrative. It was a clean, simple story supported by the tangible evidence from one extraordinary archaeological site. The possibility of a wider, more complex network of interaction was rarely considered because there was little physical evidence to support it. The vastness of the land, combined with the apparent brevity of their stay, made any deeper penetration seem like a logistical and historical fantasy. That clean, simple story is now being challenged by a scattering of tantalizing finds. In recent years, a small but growing number of artifacts have surfaced in locations that defy the old model. These objects have not been found on the coast, but far inland, sometimes hundreds of miles from the Atlantic Ocean. They are not numerous, nor are they spectacular. They are often small and easily overlooked. A piece of worked metal, a strange-looking bead, a fragment of smelted ore. But their locations are what make them so significant. They appear along ancient riverways and near known indigenous trade hubs. Consider a find from the Great Lakes region, far removed from the North Atlantic coast. An artifact identified as a type of Norse metal fastener, perhaps a cloak pin, or part of a harness. It was discovered in a context that suggests great antiquity. Another example comes from Baffin Island, much farther north. Archaeologists there found whetstones for sharpening metal tools, stones showing grooves consistent with the sharpening of iron blades. Near these whetstones, they discovered yarn spun in a distinctly Norse style, and fragments of wood that radiocarbon dating places directly in the Viking Age. These objects suggest a Norse presence, or at least a Norse influence, in places used by the local Dorset and Thule peoples. These disparate clues, when plotted on a map, begin to form a pattern. They do not suggest a wave of Viking settlement across the continent. Instead, they hint at movement. The find spots often lie along major water routes, the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes system, and the waterways connecting to Hudson Bay. These were the highways of ancient North America, used by indigenous peoples to travel and trade over immense distances. The presence of potential Norse items along these routes raises the possibility that Viking explorers or traders did not just stop at the coast. They may have learned of these inland paths and followed them, seeking new resources and new trading partners. The significance of these finds cannot be overstated, though they must be treated with caution. Each one is a potential pinprick of light in a dark map of the past. A single artifact could be explained away as a misidentification, a later trade item, or a statistical anomaly. How can we be sure a piece of wood or a fragment of yarn found deep within Canada dates back 1,000 years to the time of the Vikings? The answer lies in sophisticated scientific techniques that act like a time machine. Two of the most powerful tools are dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating. These methods give archaeologists a crucial framework, placing artifacts in a specific historical period. Without reliable dating, a potential Norse artifact is just an interesting object. With it, it becomes evidence that can rewrite history. Dendrochronology dates events by studying tree growth rings. Each year, a tree adds a ring to its trunk, and ring thickness changes with climate, wider in good years, narrower in bad ones. Scientists build master chronologies by overlapping ring patterns from thousands of trees, creating timelines that stretch back centuries. When archaeologists find wooden artifacts, like a piece from a Norse building or a boat, they match the artifact's ring pattern to the master timeline. A solar flare in 993 CE left a distinct radiocarbon spike in tree rings worldwide, providing a precise marker used to date Viking-era wood from Meadows to 1021 CE. Radiocarbon dating works on organic materials like wood, bone, cloth, charcoal. Living things absorb carbon-14 from the atmosphere. When they die, they stop absorbing it, and the isotope decays at a known rate. Measuring remaining carbon-14 lets scientists calculate how long ago the organism died. Radiocarbon is less precise than dendrochronology. It often gives ranges of decades, but it's invaluable when tree rings aren't available, for example a piece of yarn or the remains of a campfire. These dating methods filter out the noise of history. Centuries of European trade and settlement can confuse finds in North America. A metal object found inland might be a French trade good or an English trade good from the 17th century. But if an artifact is in an undisturbed layer, and organic material in that layer, like a piece of firewood or a discarded animal bone, is radiocarbon dated to 1100 CE, the argument for a later origin weakens. Science provides a temporal anchor, letting us confidently place finds in the Viking-era North Atlantic, making a Norse-style object in that context profoundly significant. But as the number of these inland finds grows, and as the scientific analysis becomes more rigorous, the possibility of a simple anomaly recedes. A new hypothesis begins to take shape, one in which the Norse presence in North America was not just a brief stopover, but a more sustained period of contact that extended, however thinly, deep into the continental interior through interaction and trade. Section 5. An ancient superhighway, tapping into indigenous networks. To understand how Norse artifacts traveled so far inland, we must look beyond the Vikings. North America was not an empty wilderness. It was crisscrossed by long-established indigenous trade networks. For thousands of years, communities were connected by vast systems of exchange. Goods, ideas. People moved along the great rivers and lakes, an ancient superhighway. These networks linked the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes to the Mississippi Valley, the Arctic to the subarctic forests. Materials traveled astonishing distances. Copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from Wyoming, shells from the Gulf of Mexico movement followed well-trodden paths, on water, on land. People knew the routes, the stopping points, the major gathering places for trade and ceremonies. The new theory doesn't picture Norsemen hacking through unknown forests. It sees them as newcomers encountering and integrating with existing systems. A Viking longship could handle the open ocean, but rivers required different skills and local knowledge. Upon arriving on the coast of Markland or Vineland, the Norse likely met indigenous groups already in these networks. Trading Norse iron for local furs could have revealed inland resources and the routes to reach them. The Norse may not have led deep expeditions themselves. Their goods often traveled farther than their people. A Norse iron nail, highly prized, could be traded hand-to-hand along rivers for hundreds of miles. Or small Norse trading parties, guided by indigenous navigators, might have traveled established routes to key centers. They would have been following a map embedded in indigenous knowledge. The Norse presence was a new input into a very old system. Section 6. The currency of contact, furs, iron, and timber. Trade is a two-way street. For a network to exist, both sides must have something the other desires. So, what goods might have fueled this speculative exchange between the Norse and the indigenous peoples of North America? The answer lies in the resources and technologies unique to each culture. The Vikings, arriving from Greenland and Iceland, lived in a world where good timber was scarce, and iron was a cornerstone of their technology. The peoples of North America, in turn, had access to a wealth of natural resources highly prized in the Old World, particularly luxurious furs. For the Norse, the forests of Markland would have been an incredible treasure. Greenland, their westernmost colony, was a land of tundra and scrub, almost entirely treeless. Building and repairing their ocean-going ships required large, straight timbers, which they had to import at great expense from Norway. The vast old-growth forests of what is now Labrador and Newfoundland would have provided an immediate and valuable resource. They could have harvested timber for repairing ships at bases like Meadows, and as a bulk commodity to transport back to their Greenland settlements, where it would have been worth a fortune. Beyond timber, the Norse possessed a technology that was transformative: iron. While some indigenous groups worked with native copper, the technology of smelting iron ore to produce hard, durable tools was unknown. A Norse iron axe had a knife, or even a simple set of nails. These tools were stronger and held an edge far better than anything made of stone, bone, or copper. The sagas themselves mention trade, describing how the Norse offered red cloth and milk in exchange for furs from the Skrælings. It is highly likely that their most valuable trade goods would have been their metal products, seen as powerful and almost magical items. On the other side of the exchange were the rich resources of the North American continent. First and foremost were furs. Beaver, fox, marten. The Norse were already heavily involved in the fur trade in Russia and Northern Europe, and would have immediately recognized the economic potential of North American pelts. In addition to furs, they may have sought walrus ivory, dried meat, and fish. This dynamic of exchanging Norse technology for American natural resources would have created a powerful incentive for ongoing contact and trade. Dating an artifact's context is one thing. Proving the artifact itself is Norse is another challenge entirely. This is where forensic science comes into play, offering a deeper analysis of the materials themselves. Metal objects can hold a chemical and structural signature that points to their origin. Archaeometallurgy, the study of ancient metals, lets scientists analyze an artifact's composition and compare it to known sources and production techniques. When scientists analyze iron, they look for key indicators. First, the smelting process. Viking-age Norse blacksmiths used bloomery furnaces, which leave characteristic slag impurities in the metal. By examining a cross-section of an iron nail under a microscope, metallurgists can spot those slag patterns. If the patterns match iron from confirmed Norse sites, Meadows, Greenland, Iceland, it suggests a common origin. It's like a fingerprint from the ancient smiths. Another technique: trace element analysis. Different ore sources have unique chemical traces. Using mass spectrometry, scientists can read an artifact's elemental fingerprint. They match that fingerprint to known ore bog signatures from Norse Greenland or Iceland. If a pin in the Canadian interior matches ore from a specific Greenland fjord, the case for Norse origin becomes very strong. This connects the object to a specific place in the Norse world. Forensic analysis has been applied to key inland finds. Results have, in some cases, ruled out later French English or indigenous origins. Example: smelted metal from Baffin Island was made in a crucible using Norse high-temperature techniques, not practiced by the Dorset. For centuries, the Norse sagas were the only source of information about the Viking voyages to North America. For centuries, the Norse sagas were the only source of information about the Viking voyages to North America. These epic tales, written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, blend historical memory with literary invention. They are not direct, factual reports. They are stories filled with heroic deeds, dramatic conflicts, mythic elements. Because of this, historians have long been cautious about using them as literal guides to the past. However, when the details described in a saga align with modern archaeological or environmental evidence, these ancient stories gain a new layer of credibility and can offer invaluable context. The Saga of the Greenlanders, the Saga of Eric the Red. They tell slightly different versions of the same events. Leif Erikson, Thorvald, Thorfinn Karlsefni. The sagas describe the landscape. The resources. Encounters with the indigenous Skrælings. They speak of gathering timber in Markland and harvesting grapes in Vinland, or berries in Vinland. For a long time, these were just evocative descriptions. But now, with a growing body of scientific data, we can start to check these details against the physical record. For example, the sagas describe Karlsefni leading a large expedition with the intent to settle, bringing livestock and families. They tell of him journeying along the coast and up a river to establish a settlement. This detail of moving up a river system resonates with the new theory of inland travel. While the sagas do not explicitly describe a continent-spanning trade network, they do portray the Norse as actively exploring river mouths and interacting with local populations for trade. The stories of tension and violence also match the archaeological reality. The Norse did not stay, and conflict may well have been a primary reason for their departure from the main settlement. Most compellingly, we can now cross-reference environmental data with saga descriptions. Palynology, the study of ancient pollen, can reconstruct the vegetation of a region 1,000 years ago, when the sagas describe a land of forests, Markland, and a land of wild grapes or berries, Vinland. We can now look for areas where the pollen record confirms such plants grew during the warmer climate of the medieval warm period. When a saga detail, like a description of a specific type of coastline or a prominent river, matches the geography of a place where a potential Norse artifact has been found, it creates a powerful convergence of evidence. The sagas are not a map, but they may be a guidebook, offering echoes of real events that science is just now beginning to confirm. The accumulation of this new evidence, inland artifacts, scientific dating, forensic analysis, corroborating sagas is beginning to cause a fundamental shift in our understanding. It challenges us to move beyond the simple story of a failed colony at Meadows. The emerging picture is not one of large-scale Viking settlement across North America. Instead, it suggests a more complex and nuanced footprint. It points to a period of sustained, low-intensity contact that was primarily driven by trade and resource extraction, and which utilized the existing indigenous networks to penetrate far beyond the coast. This new perspective changes the very nature of the Norse presence. If the Vikings were not just confined to a single coastal site, but were interacting with multiple indigenous groups along major trade arteries, then their influence could have been much broader than previously imagined. The introduction of even a small amount of Norse iron into the pre-existing trade systems could have had significant ripple effects. An iron knife or axe head would have been a high-status object, a tool of superior efficiency, and perhaps even a symbol of spiritual power. The desire to acquire such goods could have altered local trade priorities and even relationships between different indigenous groups. Rethinking the Viking footprint also means reconsidering the duration and character of their stay. The old model pictured a brief attempt at colonization that ended in failure and complete withdrawal after only a few years. The new model allows for a much longer period of contact. Norse ships might have continued to make seasonal voyages to North America to trade for furs and gather timber. These would not have been large colonization fleets, but smaller, commercially minded expeditions. They would leave a much lighter archaeological trace, which would explain why we have not found another large settlement like Meadows. The evidence would be scattered, subtle, and found in the context of indigenous sites. This revised view places the Norse in North America into a different historical context. It moves them from being failed colonizers to being participants in a globalized world, connecting the economic systems of Europe with those of the Americas 5 centuries before Columbus. They were not just raiders or explorers, they were traders, operating at the farthest edge of their known world. This does not diminish the achievement of the indigenous peoples. On the contrary, it highlights the sophistication and resilience of their own networks, which were robust enough to absorb and interact with these strange newcomers from across the sea. The story becomes less about a European discovery and more about a moment of transatlantic contact and exchange. The possibility of an extensive Viking Age network in North America is an exciting and revolutionary idea. It opens a new frontier in the study of our past. However, as we explore this frontier, both caution and curiosity must be our guides. The evidence remains sparse and is open to interpretation. Each new potential find must be subjected to the most rigorous scientific scrutiny. The risk of exaggeration and wishful thinking is high. Sensationalist claims of Viking armies marching across the plains, secret runestones in Oklahoma, have clouded the field for years. The real scientific work is slow, methodical, and painstaking. Future research will be key to either confirming or refuting this emerging theory. Archaeologists will need to strategically survey areas along known indigenous trade routes, looking for the subtle signs of a foreign presence. New advances in laboratory analysis will allow for even more precise tracing of metals, textiles, organic materials. Collaboration is essential. Archaeologists must work closely with indigenous communities, whose oral histories and traditional knowledge of the land can provide invaluable clues and context that science alone cannot. This is a story that belongs to many peoples, and it must be investigated with respect and partnership. We must remain open to the idea that history is not a closed book. Old narratives can be revised in the light of new discoveries. The story of the Norse in America is a perfect example. For 50 years, we had a clear and satisfying answer. Now, that answer is becoming more complex and far more interesting. We may be standing at the beginning of a major reassessment, one that will ultimately enrich our understanding of long-distance connections. The map of the past is still unfolding. The final lesson is humility and patience. The Earth gives up its secrets slowly. Each artifact is a word, each archaeological site a sentence. It will take many more discoveries to read the full chapter of the Norse in the heart of North America. For now, we have a compelling hypothesis, supported by a growing collection of clues. It invites us to look deeper, to ask new questions, and to imagine a distant past that was far more interconnected than we ever thought possible. The search continues, driven by the enduring human desire to understand the full, complex story of who we are and how we all came to be here.